The shatter of glass was the first sound, a violent crystalline explosion that ripped through the sleepy afternoon hum of Redemption Creek. Jedediah Jed Kane looked up from the harness he was mending, his hands, calloused and steady from years of ranch work, freezing in place. Dust motes danced in the slanted bars of light, cutting through the livery stable, suddenly agitated. Then came the second sound, a woman's scream, sharp and terrified, followed by the percussive crack of a gunshot that echoed off the weathered storefronts. Instinct, buried under 5 years of sweat and solitude, surged through him. The calm ranch hand vanished, replaced by something older, harder. Jed dropped the leather strap and moved his stride, long and silent. He stepped out of the livery's cool darkness and into the blinding glare of the Texas sun. Across the dusty main street, the Redemption Savings and Trust was under assault. Men in long dusters, their faces obscured by bandanas, herded panicked townsfolk out of the building. Jed's body wanted to move forward to draw a weapon he no longer carried, but his mind screamed at him to stay put. He wasn't that man anymore. He was Jed Kane, a hired hand who kept his head down and his past buried deeper than a winter well. The Texas Rangers were a lifetime ago a ghost he'd spent half a decade trying to outrun. But then he saw the man in charge. He stood on the bank's porch, a tall figure of chilling authority. Unlike his men, his face was uncovered. He was handsome in a severe way, with sharp cheekbones, a neatly trimmed dark beard, and eyes as cold and gray as a storm-swept sky. He moved with an unnerving calm amidst the chaos, his voice cutting through the din, not with a shout, but with a precise, commanding tone. This was Silas Blackwood. Jed didn't know the name, but he recognized the type of predator who enjoyed the fear he inspired. Blackwood wasn't just directing his men to load saddlebags with cash. He was orchestrating a performance. As the bank manager, a portly, sweating man named Henderson, was shoved onto the porch, Blackwood's gaze fell upon Mrs. Henderson, who was huddled with the other women. "Ma'am." Blackwood said, his voice deceptively gentle. He strode over to her, and the crowd held its collective breath. He didn't reach for her purse. Instead, his gloved fingers went to the delicate silver chain around her neck. "That's a lovely locket." Mrs. Henderson trembled, tears streaming down her face. "Please, it was my mother's." Blackwood's smile was a bloodless slash. "A sentimental piece, then. My favorite kind." He unclasped it with an almost surgical precision and held it up. The silver glinted in the sun, a small, oval piece intricately etched with the image of a desert wildflower. Jed's breath hitched in his throat. His heart felt as though it had been seized by an icy fist. It was identical. The same design, the same wildflower etching the same delicate chain. It was a perfect copy of the locket his wife Sarah had worn. The locket she was wearing the day she died. The locket he had buried with her. The robbery, the money, the terror. It all faded into the background. This wasn't a random act of greed. The world narrowed to that small piece of silver dangling from the outlaw's fingers. Blackwood wasn't just robbing a bank. He was delivering a message. He was digging up a grave. Blackwood pocketed the locket and turned his cold eyes, sweeping them across the street, across the faces of the terrified onlookers. For a split second, his gaze locked with Jed's. There was no recognition in them, not of Jed the man, but there was something else, a chilling, deliberate intent. It was the look of a hunter who knows his prey is watching, who enjoys the slow, agonizing process of the chase. The outlaws mounted their horses, firing a final volley of shots into the air that sent townspeople scrambling for cover. They thundered out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence in their wake. Jed remained standing in the shadow of the livery, his knuckles white where he gripped a post. The careful walls he had built around his heart for 5 years had been shattered as easily as the bank's front window. He had come to Redemption Creek to forget to let the man he once was die. But Silas Blackwood, with the theft of a single silver locket, had just resurrected him. The ghosts of his past were no longer whispering. They were screaming his name. Redemption Creek was a town clinging to existence by a thread of water and a surplus of grit. It was a collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings huddled together against the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Texas plains. The dust was a constant companion, settling on everything, a fine red powder that tasted of iron and eternity. Yet for Jed, its harshness had been a comfort. The relentless sun and the back-breaking work of a ranch hand left no room for the ghosts that haunted the quiet hours. He worked for the Miller family, a decent couple with 2 young sons, and his life had fallen into a rhythm of mending fences, breaking horses, and seeking the profound emptiness of exhaustion each night. To the townsfolk, Jed Kane was a fixture as stoic and reliable as the old oak in the town square. He was quiet, his words measured and few, but there was a deep-seated sorrow in his blue eyes that kept most people at a respectful distance. He was the man you could count on to help raise a barn or track a lost steer, but he was not a man you asked about his past. Only 2 people in town knew the truth or parts of it. Sheriff Elias Thorne was one. Elias was a man worn smooth by the years, his face a roadmap of prairie sun and worry. He'd known Jed back in the ranger days, had seen the fire in the young lawman before it had been violently extinguished. When Jed had drifted into his town 5 years ago, a hollowed-out version of the man he remembered, Elias, had offered him a deputy's badge. Jed had refused with a quiet finality that left no room for argument. Elias, respecting the ghosts he couldn't see, had let it be. The other was Clara Sims, and the town's schoolteacher. She was a woman of surprising resilience, having come west after losing her family to a fever back east. She saw past the wall Jed had built. She saw the kindness in the way he spoke to the Miller boys, and the intelligence in his rare, thoughtful comments. Clara would often leave a book for him at the general store, or engage him in conversation about the weather's small, patient gestures that chipped away at his solitude. In her presence, Jed felt a flicker of a life he thought had died with Sarah, a warmth that was both terrifying and deeply longed for. The bank robbery shattered the town's fragile peace. Fear, thick and cloying, settled over Redemption Creek. But it was more than just the lost money. Silas Blackwood's gang wasn't behaving like typical outlaws. They weren't just hitting banks and disappearing. They were systematically choking the life out of the valley. Over the past few months, a smooth-talking lawyer from out of state had been buying up land deeds, and more importantly, the water rights to the creek that fed the entire region. The ranchers who refused to sell found their livestock mysteriously sickened, their fences cut, their wells fouled. It was economic warfare, slow and insidious, and everyone knew Blackwood's gang was the muscle behind it. They all assumed it was a ruthless land grab, a play to control the entire territory before the railroad came through. Jed knew better. The locket had changed everything. This wasn't about land or water. It was about him. Every cut fence, every poisoned well felt like a prelude, a tightening of the noose around a town he had inadvertently made his sanctuary. He saw Sarah's face in his dreams, the wildflower locket gleaming at her throat, her eyes filled with a sad premonition. He was bringing death to this place just by being here. A week after the robbery, the scent of smoke woke Jed from a restless sleep. He was out of his small bunkhouse in an instant, his eyes scanning the horizon. Against the pre-dawn sky, a hellish orange glow flickered to the west. The Miller Ranch. He didn't hesitate. He saddled his horse with a speed and efficiency that belonged to another life, his movements economical and precise. By the time he galloped into the Miller homestead, the barn was a roaring inferno, the greedy flames licking at the night sky. The family was outside, their faces illuminated by the destructive light, their nightclothes stark against the swirling embers. The barn was a lost cause, but the fire was spreading, threatening the main house. The boys. Mrs. Miller shrieked, her voice raw with panic. Thomas is still in his room. Without a thought for his own safety, Jed ran toward the house. He kicked in the front door, the heat a physical blow. Smoke clawed at his lungs, thick and acrid. He found the boy's room, the flames already consuming the far wall. Thomas, the miller's youngest son, was huddled under his bed, coughing and crying. Jed scooped him up, shielding the boy's small body with his own, and fought his way back through the blinding smoke and searing heat. He emerged onto the lawn, gasping for air, his clothes singed and his face blackened with soot. He placed the terrified but unharmed boy into his mother's arms. But as he turned back to help fight the flames, a section of the barn's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and fire. A burning beam flew through the air, striking the miller's older son Daniel, who had been helping his father with the water buckets. The boy cried out and fell, his leg trapped and burning. Jed was on him in a second, rolling the boy in the dirt to smother the flames on his clothes and heaving the heavy beam off his leg. But the damage was done. Daniel's leg was badly burned, his face pale with pain and shock. By the time the rest of the town arrived to help, the barn was a smoldering ruin, and the house was saved, but the cost was etched on every face. Standing beside the exhausted Miller family, looking at young Daniel's injured leg, Jed felt a cold, hard certainty settle in his gut. This wasn't random intimidation. This was another message more brutal than the first. Blackwood had targeted a family. Jed was close to a family he cared for. He had harmed a child. The next morning, Jed walked into the sheriff's office. The smell of stale coffee and old paper filled the air. Elias looked up from his desk, his weary eyes taking in Jed's soot-stained clothes and the grim set of his jaw. "You heard what you did at the Miller place," Elias said, his voice gravelly. "You saved that boy's life. The other one got hurt." Jed stated flatly, the words tasting like ash. "Because of me." Elias sighed, leaning back in his chair. "This ain't on you, Jed. It's Blackwood." "It's the same thing." Jed walked to the desk and stood before his old acquaintance. He was done running. Running had only led the wolf to another flock. "Elias, I need your help. A few years back. Asked me to wear a badge." Elias's eyes sharpened. He sat up straighter, a flicker of the old lawman returning to his posture. "I did." "Is the offer still good?" Elias didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He saw the answer in the cold fire that had rekindled in Jed's eyes. He opened a drawer and pulled out a tarnished, star-shaped badge. He slid it across the desk. It came to a stop in front of Jed, the metal catching the morning light. Jed stared at it for a long moment. It felt heavier than a mountain, freighted with all the pain and loss he had tried to leave behind. But looking at it, he didn't see the ghosts of his past. He saw Daniel Miller's burned leg. He saw Mrs. Henderson's terrified face. He saw the silver locket. He picked up the badge, its points sharp against his palm. He wasn't pinning it on for the law or for the town or even for himself. He was pinning it on for them. Because Silas Blackwood had made it personal, and the time for redemption was over. This was about reckoning. Jed's first act as deputy was to trade his rancher's clothes for the worn denim and leather of his past. The simple act of strapping on a gun belt felt both foreign and disturbingly natural. With the weight of a Colt peacemaker settled on his hip, he began his investigation not with force, but with the quiet, methodical patience that had once made him one of the best trackers in the Texas Rangers. He started with the lawyer who had bought the water rights. A visit to the man's office in the next county revealed two things. First, the man was long gone, having vanished the day after the last deed was signed. Second, the paperwork was impeccable. Every transaction was legal signed and sealed. Blackwood wasn't a common thug. He was a brilliant strategist using the law itself as a weapon to mask his true intentions. He had created a fortress of legitimacy around his criminal enterprise, making a direct assault nearly impossible. Frustrated, Jed turned his attention to tracking the gang itself. He spent days in the saddle, crisscrossing the arid landscape, his eyes reading the subtle language of the land. He found their tracks, but they were clever. They rode over rock to hide their trail, split into smaller groups, and backtracked frequently. It was disciplined, almost military in its precision. This wasn't a gang. It was an army. Finally, after a week of relentless pursuit, he found a clear trail leading into a narrow, winding canyon 20 miles north of town. Elias insisted on sending 2 of his other deputies, young men full of courage, but short on experience with him. Jed argued against it, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach, but Elias was firm. "You're not doing this alone, Jed. Not anymore." As they rode into the canyon, the towering rock walls seemed to press in on them, amplifying the sound of their horses' hooves. The air grew still and heavy. Jed's senses screamed at him. The silence was wrong. Too perfect. "It's a trap," he said, reining in his horse. The words were barely out of his mouth when the first shot rang out, echoing like a thunderclap through the canyon. One of the young deputies cried out and slumped from his saddle, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Gunfire erupted from the cliffs above, a coordinated storm of lead that pinned them down. It was a perfectly laid ambush. Jed reacted on pure instinct, diving from his horse and pulling the remaining deputy, a boy named Peters, behind a cluster of boulders. Bullets sparked off the rocks around them. They were hopelessly outgunned and outmaneuvered. "We have to fall back." Peters yelled, his face pale with terror. "There is no back." Jed replied, his voice calm and cold, as he peered through a gap in the rocks. He could see them now, figures positioned with tactical perfection on the ridges above. "He wanted us in here." Jed knew their only chance was to do the unexpected. He laid down covering fire, his shots precise, forcing the ambushers to keep their heads down. "When I move, you run for the mouth of the canyon. Don't stop for anything. Go." Before Peters could argue, Jed broke from cover, drawing the bulk of the fire toward himself as he scrambled up a steep rock face, moving with a speed and agility that defied his years as a rancher. He reached a narrow ledge, giving him a better angle. He fired twice. 2 of the ambushers fell. But there were too many. A bullet grazed his arm, a hot, searing pain. Another tore through his hat. He saw Peters make his break, running low and fast, back the way they came. For a moment, it looked like he would make it. Then, a single shot from a high ridge, clean and expertly placed, dropped the boy in his tracks. Jed was alone. The firing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that descended was more terrifying than the gunfire. A voice amplified by the canyon's acoustics floated down from above. It was Blackwood. "Impressive, Ranger," the voice mocked. "But not impressive enough. This is just a taste of what's to come." Jed stayed hidden. His breathing controlled his mind racing. He heard the sound of horses moving away. When he was certain they were gone, he cautiously made his way down to where Peters lay. The boy was dead. So was the other deputy. He had led them to their deaths. As he knelt beside Peters, a wave of familiar guilt washing over him, he saw something scratched into the dusty ground near the body. It wasn't a random mark. It was a phrase drawn with the tip of a knife or a bullet. No, just like Whisper Canyon. The words hit Jed with the force of a physical blow. Whisper Canyon. The place where his life had ended. The place where Sarah had died. This wasn't just a message anymore. This was a ghost story, and Silas Blackwood was making him relive every single page. He knew Jed's past. He knew his greatest failure. And he was using it to systematically take apart his present. The ambush hadn't been about killing him. It had been about isolating him, about reminding him that anyone who stood beside him was destined to fall. The deaths of the two deputies settled over Redemption Creek like a funeral shroud. The town's fear curdled into something uglier, despair. Jed, now the sole deputy, became the focus of that despair. Some looked at him with pity, others with suspicion. He was the one who had survived. He ignored the whispers, retreating into the cold, analytical mindset of his ranger days. He worked out of the sheriff's office, often sleeping on the cot in the back, poring over maps and old records. He was no longer just a lawman. He was a man haunted, hunting a ghost, who knew his every weakness. He began to piece together a portrait of his enemy. Silas Blackwood's men weren't hired guns picked up in saloons. They were fiercely loyal, disciplined, and moved like soldiers. Jed found records of them buying supplies in towns 50 miles away, always paying in cash, never causing trouble. They were ghosts, leaving almost no trace. He also started a quiet investigation into the incident at Whisper Canyon. He sent telegrams to old contacts, asking guarded questions, careful not to reveal his purpose. He was searching for a connection, any thread that could link that horrible day to Silas Blackwood. The memories of that day, which he had kept locked away in a dark corner of his mind, began to break free. They came to him in fractured, tormenting flashes. Sunlight filtering through the trees in Whisper Canyon. Sarah had insisted on coming along packing a picnic. "It's a beautiful day, Jed," she'd said, her smile radiant. "You spend too much time chasing shadows." A tip about a notorious outlaw, Frank Thorne, holing up in the canyon. It was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission. Just him and his partner Marcus Thorne, no relation to the outlaw, a bitter irony he would later appreciate. The sudden chaotic eruption of gunfire. They'd walked into an ambush. Or so he thought. Bullets tearing through the trees, Sarah screaming his name. Marcus yelling, "They've got a civilian." Jed firing back, trying to get to Sarah, who was caught in the open. The world dissolving into smoke and noise and the coppery scent of blood. He would wake from these flashes in a cold sweat, the phantom smell of gunpowder in his nostrils. The official report, written by Marcus and corroborated by a grief-stricken, incoherent Jed, had been simple: a botched ambush, a civilian tragically killed in the crossfire. Frank Thorne had escaped. The incident had shattered Jed. He'd turned in his badge, unable to bear the weight of the star that had led his wife to her death. During this dark period, Clara became his only anchor to the present. She would bring him meals at the sheriff's office, her presence a quiet, unassuming comfort. She never pushed him to talk, but her intelligent eyes told him she understood he was fighting a war on two fronts, one against Blackwood and one against himself. One evening, she found him staring at a map of the territory, his face haggard in the lamplight. "You can't carry all of this alone, Jed," she said softly, placing a plate of stew on his desk. "It's my burden to carry," he replied, his voice rough. "Is it?" she challenged gently. "Or is it a burden you've chosen not to set down? Whatever happened in your past, it doesn't have to define your future." He looked at her, then truly looked at her. He saw not pity but strength. She was offering him a hand to hold in the darkness, a glimpse of a sunrise after a long, terrible night. The thought of a future, a life with her, was a fragile, beautiful thing, a flower blooming in the middle of a battlefield. It terrified him because it gave Blackwood something else to take. The stakes were no longer just about the town or his own survival. They were about her. He was beginning to care for her deeply, and in his world, caring for someone was the most dangerous thing you could do. Jed's breakthrough came from a stroke of desperate luck. He learned that one of Blackwood's key men, a hard-faced man named Calloway, had a weakness for a particular brand of whiskey only sold at a trading post 50 miles to the south. Jed staked out the post for 3 days, living on jerky and stale water until Calloway appeared. The takedown was swift and silent. Jed cornered him in an alley behind the post, his pistol pressed to the man's temple before Calloway could even reach for his own weapon. He brought him back to Redemption Creek under the cover of darkness, securing him in one of the jail cells. The interrogation was a battle of wills. Calloway was stone loyal to Blackwood to a fault. Threats didn't work. Bribery was laughed at. For 2 days, Jed got nothing. He sat across from the outlaw in the dim light of the cell, the silence stretching between them. Jed knew that breaking this man required not force, but the right key to the right lock. "He's got you all convinced it's about loyalty, doesn't he?" Jed said on the 3rd day, his voice conversational. "That you're part of some grand cause." Calloway just sneered. "I know about Whisper Canyon," Jed said, watching the man's eyes. He saw a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible reaction. "He's not telling you the whole story." Jed began to talk, not about Blackwood, but about that day. He spoke of his wife, of the picnic, of the life he had lost. He laid his own pain bare not as a tactic, but as a simple, unvarnished truth. He painted a picture of the tragedy, of the senseless loss. "That's what this is about." Jed concluded, his voice low. "Not land, not money. It's about that day. He's destroying this valley, killing innocent people for something that happened 5 years ago. Is that the cause you signed up for?" Calloway was silent for a long time. The bravado had leached out of him, replaced by a troubled uncertainty. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy. "You got it wrong. It ain't about what happened. It's about who it happened to." Jed leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "Blackwood ain't his real name," Calloway said, finally breaking. "He only started using it a few years back. His real name is Thorne. Silas Thorne." The name hit Jed like a physical blow. Thorne. The man you Rangers were hunting that day in Whisper Canyon. Calloway continued, the words spilling out now. "The man you killed. Frank Thorne. He wasn't some big outlaw. He was a homesteader. A farmer. Silas's older brother. He'd gotten into a dispute with a cattle baron who wanted his land. The baron paid someone to brand Frank an outlaw, put a price on his head." Jed felt the floor drop out from under him. An innocent man. He had killed an innocent man. Silas saw the whole thing. Calloway whispered, his eyes distant. "He was just a kid hiding in the woods. He watched you gun down his brother. Watched his family's home get burned to the ground by the baron's men afterward. He doesn't want your land, Ranger. He doesn't give a damn about the water. He wants revenge. He spent 5 years building his army, getting his money, all for one purpose: to find you and to burn down your world just like you burned down his." The confession recast the entire narrative of Jed's life. The robberies, the intimidation, the dead deputies, it wasn't a campaign of greed. It was a meticulous, personal, and deeply intimate act of vengeance. Jed wasn't fighting to save a town anymore. He was standing on the rubble of his own past, facing a man whose life he had unknowingly destroyed. The weight of his guilt was no longer a ghost. It was a living, breathing man named Silas Thorne, and he had come to collect his debt in blood. The revelation shattered Jed's resolve. The cold certainty that had guided him was replaced by a suffocating blanket of guilt. He had built his grief around the idea that he had failed to protect Sarah, that his life as a ranger had inadvertently led to her death. But this was worse. He hadn't just failed to protect, he had actively destroyed. He was the villain in Silas Thorne's story, the face of the innocent homesteader, a man he couldn't even remember, clearly merged with Sarah's in his nightmares. His focus, once razor-sharp, became dull and scattered. He moved through his days in a fog of self-recrimination. Elias noticed the change, the fire in Jed's eyes banked to a smoldering ember. "Whatever you learned, son," the old sheriff advised, "you can't let it break you. Not now." But Jed was already broken. And Silas, with the predatory instinct of a master hunter, sensed his weakness. He chose that moment to strike his final devastating blow. It happened at dawn. A tremendous explosion rocked the entire valley, shaking the buildings in Redemption Creek and sending a pillar of dust and rock into the sky. Jed and Elias scrambled to their horses, riding hard toward the source of the blast. They found it at the narrowest point of the canyon, where the town's main irrigation canal, its very lifeblood, had been meticulously engineered. Or where it used to be. A massive section of the canyon wall had been blasted away, with dynamite burying the canal under tons of rock and soil. The flow of water that sustained every farm, ranch, and family in the valley was gone, reduced to a muddy trickle. It was a death sentence. Without water, Redemption Creek would wither and die, its people forced to abandon their homes and livelihoods. Silas hadn't just choked the town, he had slit its throat. As Jed stood staring at the catastrophic damage, the scale of Silas's hatred became terrifyingly clear. He wasn't just going to kill Jed. He was going to make him watch as everything and everyone he had sworn to protect turned to dust. He returned to town, and the stunned silence of the townsfolk more deafening than any cry of panic. Their hope, which had briefly flickered when Jed pinned on the badge, was extinguished. As he walked toward the sheriff's office, he saw Clara hurrying from the schoolhouse, her face etched with concern. She started toward him, her hand outstretched. Before she could reach him, two of Blackwood's men materialized from the alley beside the general store. They moved with brutal efficiency, grabbing her before she could scream. One clamped a hand over her mouth while the other pinned her arms. Jed's hand flew to his gun, but they were too fast. They dragged her onto a waiting horse and galloped out of town, leaving Jed standing helpless in the middle of the street. A third rider trotted forward and tossed a piece of paper into the dust at Jed's feet before wheeling his horse and following the others. Jed's hands trembled as he picked it up. The message was short, the handwriting elegant and cruel. Whisper Canyon, sundown, come alone. A life for a life. Your woman for my brother. It wasn't a ransom. It was an invitation to an execution. Silas had taken everything. He had destroyed the town's future and stolen the only person who represented Jed's. He had stripped him of his purpose, his hope, and his will, leaving only the crushing weight of his past. And now he was summoning him back to where it all began, to the site of his original sin, to finish the story once and for all. Whisper Canyon was a place of ghosts and bitter memories. As Jed rode into its familiar shadowed entrance, the setting sun painted the high rock walls in shades of blood and rust. A storm was brewing on the western horizon, the sky a bruised purple, and a low, mournful wind whispered through the pines, sounding like a lament. The air was heavy, charged with tension and the coming rain. He saw them at the far end of the canyon near the edge of a steep cliff. Clara was there, tied to a lone skeletal pine tree, her face pale, but her eyes defiant. Standing a few feet away was Silas Thorne, a silhouette of vengeance against the dying light. He wasn't alone. Another figure stood beside him, head bowed, almost folded in on himself. "You came." Silas called out, his voice calm, carrying on the wind. "I knew you would. A man like you can't resist a chance at redemption, no matter how futile." Jed dismounted, his hands held away from his gun. "Let her go, Thorn. This is between you and me." Silas laughed, a cold, empty sound. "Oh, it is. But first a confession. I want to hear it from your own lips. I want you to tell her." He gestured to Clara. "And tell him—" He nodded at the broken man beside him. "Exactly what you did on this ground 5 years ago. I want you to relive it. Every detail." Jed's gaze flickered to the other man. As the figure lifted his head, Jed's blood ran cold. It was Marcus Thorn, his former partner. He was older, thinner, his face a mask of fear and shame. This was the final cruel turn of the screw. Silas hadn't just brought Jed to the scene of the crime. He had brought the only other witness. "Tell us, Ranger." Silas pressed his eyes, gleaming with a feverish intensity. "Tell us how you murdered an innocent man." Jed looked at Clara, at the fear in her eyes, and knew he had no choice. He began to speak, his voice a low, ragged thing. He recounted the events of that day, the words like stones in his throat. He spoke of the faulty tip of bringing Sarah, of walking into what he thought was an ambush. "We were pinned down." Jed said, the memories flooding back with agonizing clarity. Frank Thorn was across the clearing near that grove of aspens. He wasn't even holding a gun. He was just a man, startled, confused. He paused, a detail surfacing from the depths of his memory, a piece of the puzzle that had never quite fit. The shots were coming from the ridge to the west. But Frank Thorn fell forward, toward us. Silas's smile faltered for a second. "He was caught in your crossfire." "No." Jed said, his voice gaining strength as the truth suppressed for 5 years by grief and guilt finally broke free. "My position was here. Marcus was over there to the east. A bullet from my gun would have hit him from the side or back. He was shot from the front." He looked directly at his former partner. Marcus was the only one with that angle. His rifle, it had a different report, a heavier caliber. I remember the sound now. It was his shot. You fired recklessly, Marcus. You killed him. The canyon fell silent, save for the whistling wind. Marcus Thorn crumpled to his knees, sobbing. I didn't mean to. The Baron said he was dangerous. I panicked. I fired. And then you lied. Jed finished, the full weight of the betrayal crashing down on him. You manipulated the report. You let me take the blame, let me live with it, let me destroy my own life over a crime you committed. Silas stared, his face a maelstrom of confusion and fury. His entire life's purpose, the righteous vengeance that had fueled him for 5 years, was built on a lie. It wasn't the heroic ranger who had murdered his brother. It was a coward who had hidden behind him. He lies. Silas snarled, but the conviction was gone from his voice. He turned to Marcus. Tell me he lies. Marcus could only shake his head, his body racked with pathetic sobs. It's true. It was me. That confession was the spark. The complex theatrical revenge plot crumbled into a raw, primal need for violence. The standoff exploded. Silas drew his pistol, but he wasn't aiming at Jed. He was aiming at the sniveling wreck of Marcus Thorn, the true author of his family's pain. Jed moved not to attack, but to save. He lunged, tackling Silas just as he fired. The shot went wide, ricocheting off the canyon wall. The The two men crashed to the ground, a desperate, brutal tangle of limbs. It wasn't a duel of gunslingers. It was a brawl fought with fists, rocks, and raw desperation. The brewing storm finally broke rain, lashing down, turning the dusty ground to slick mud. Jed fought with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't fighting for revenge, but for the future. For Clara. For the town. For the chance to finally live a life free of the ghosts of Whisper Canyon. He gained the upper hand, his knuckles bloody, and wrenched the gun from Silas's grasp. He held the pistol to the man's head, Silas's chest heaving beneath him. For a moment he was tempted. One pull of the trigger would end it all. But looking down at Silas's face, he saw not a monster, but a man consumed by a grief as profound as his own. Killing him would be an act of vengeance, not justice. Jed tossed the gun aside. "It's over, Thorne." The words seemed to break something in Silas. His life's purpose, his 5-year quest, had evaporated into a sordid truth of cowardice and lies. His brother hadn't been killed by a legend. He'd been killed by a mistake. Seeing his world utterly destroyed, Silas let out a roar of pure, animalistic despair. He lunged not at Jed, but toward the cliff edge where Clara was tied. Jed scrambled to intercept him, but Silas wasn't trying to hurt her. He was simply running toward the edge. In his madness and grief, with his life's mission revealed as a sham, there was nowhere left to go. With a final anguished cry that was swallowed by the wind and the rain, Silas Thorne threw himself from the cliff and vanished into the churning darkness of the canyon below. In the immediate stunned aftermath of Silas's fall, what the only sounds were the driving rain and the pathetic whimpers of Marcus Thorne. Jed, breathing heavily, his body bruised and aching, stumbled over to Clara and cut her free. She fell into his arms, her body trembling, and he held her tight, the steady beat of her heart against his chest, a grounding affirmation of life. He pulled Marcus to his feet, the man offering no resistance, and secured his hands. The long, silent ride back to Redemption Creek was a grim procession through the cleansing storm. When they arrived, the town was dark, its people huddled in their homes, waiting. Jed marched Marcus into the sheriff's office, where Elias was keeping a lonely vigil, and locked him in a cell. "It's over, Elias," Jed said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. He took Clara to the doctor's office to have the rope burns on her wrists tended to. Afterward, they sat in the quiet of her small home behind the schoolhouse. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. In the soft light of a kerosene lamp, Jed finally told her everything. He spoke of Sarah, of Marcus's betrayal, and of the crushing guilt he had carried for 5 years. He held nothing back, the words pouring out of him, washing away the poison of his long-held secrets. Clara listened, her hand resting on his offering, not pity, but a profound and unwavering understanding. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jed felt truly free. The next morning, the truth spread through the town. Marcus Thorne's confession, relayed by Elias, painted Jed not as a haunted drifter who had brought trouble, but as a hero who had confronted his own demons to save them. The looks of suspicion were replaced by expressions of gratitude and deep respect. Elias found Jed standing on the porch of the sheriff's office, looking out at the town as it began the slow process of coming back to life. Men were already gathering with shovels and picks, ready to begin the Herculean task of clearing the irrigation canal. "They're sending a federal marshal for Marcus," Elias said. "He'll see the inside of a prison for a long time." He paused, then unpinned the sheriff's badge from his own vest. "This town needs a leader, Jed. A real one. I'm too old for this fight. The badge is yours if you want it." Jed looked at the star in the old man's palm, and this time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise. Weeks later, a fragile hope had taken root in Redemption Creek. The canal was cleared, and water clean, and life-giving flowed once more through the valley. The scorched timbers of the miller's barn had been cleared away, and the foundation for a new one was being laid by the hands of the entire community. Marcus Thorne was gone, sent to a federal prison to pay for his crimes of cowardice and deceit. After much consideration, Jed accepted Elias's offer. The weight of the sheriff's badge on his chest now felt right a symbol not of a painful past, but of a purposeful future. One clear, cool afternoon, he rode out to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. There were 2 graves he needed to visit. He stood before Sarah's simple wooden cross for a long time, speaking to her in the quiet of his heart, telling her he was finally letting go of the guilt, but never the love. He placed a single wild desert primrose on the earth, a flower much like the one etched on her locket. Then he walked to another plot a few yards away. He had arranged for the body of Frank Thorne to be moved from its unmarked grave in Whisper Canyon and given a proper burial here. The simple headstone read, "Frank Thorne, a good man wrongly accused." Jed took his old tarnished Texas Ranger badge from his pocket. For 5 years it had been a symbol of his greatest failure. Now he saw it for what it was, a piece of his past. He placed it on the fresh mound of earth, an offering of apology and a final act of closure. As he walked away from the graves, leaving the past behind him, he saw Clara waiting for him at the cemetery gate. She smiled a quiet, beautiful expression that promised a new beginning. He took her hand, their fingers lacing together naturally, and together they stood on the hilltop, looking out over the recovering town. The future, like the valley below them, was no longer shrouded in shadow. It was clear, verdant, and full of promise. Jed Kane had come to Redemption Creek to run from his life. But in facing his past, he had unexpectedly found a new one. He had found a home, a purpose, and a chance to build a legacy, not of violence and loss, but of peace and unwavering strength.